Hi! So today I want to show you how you can start designing your own dialogue system, kind of like what you see here. So the way I did this is I have an image here in the corner representing what NPC you might be talking to at the time, or maybe what object you're looking at. Then there's some text, whatever the NPC might be saying, and then you have some options here where you can click on how you want to react to it. If I take the last option here, I can just close the window immediately. I can spawn a new dialogue in. I can select this one and there comes a reply. Or I can select this one and there comes another reply. And stuff like that. You can link these together however you like and really make any size and complexity of a conversation. Now today I'm not going to go over how you can move these kind of things into a JSON file or how you can use any kind of fancy plugins. There are some good dialogue plugins for the Godot engine, but for now I would rather stick to the basics and show you how you can do it inside the engine, and we can go over alternative details later on. So how do we implement this stuff? First of all, I made a folder here for my dialogue system. It contains some images, which is the Godot icon and my necromancer.png. And it contains a font I'm just using. It's technically a theme, but all it has is the font in it, so it looks a little bit better than the default font inside of Godot. This part isn't really necessary at all. New scene, test scene, sure, user interface. So we have a control that is covering the entire screen. Let's give it a color rect. So we have a background. Give it some grayish color that's a bit more colorful, maybe something like that. And yeah, this is essentially gonna be our background we are working in. In reality, there might be some game scene in the background, maybe a 3D game or whatever it is, really, it doesn't matter. But here, since there's nothing else, I'm just putting a background to make it a bit clearer what we're working with. Now, what is our thing going to look like? So what our thing is gonna look like is, first of all, I'm gonna make a control. Let's have it cover part of the screen instead of all of it, I guess. Something like that. And this is the area that's actually gonna be used by this. So if I use a color rect again, give it the full rect, give it a darker color, so we can tell it apart a bit. And yeah, this is essentially the entire dialog box. So we want a section up here for the NPC text and a section down here for player options. So let's put a VBox container. Sure, it can use the entire thing for now. I suppose to make it a bit prettier, let's give it a bit of margins. Let's say 10, 10, minus 10, minus 10. And then we want two control nodes in here. One for the NPC, I'll just call it NPC section, and one for the player. And let's give them some size flags so they actually take up the available space. Okay, we still want to be able to see them, so I'm again gonna use a color rect. It's just the easiest option to visualize exactly where a control starts and ends. So there we go, we have these two sections built up. A bit of a gap in between. You can change the settings for that in here, of course. Now, let's build up the NPC section. It's going to need some space for an image, like we had earlier. So I'll just use a texture rect for this. It's going to need some space for text, so I can just use a label for this. And since we want these things to be next to each other, I can use an hbox container, drag the two in there, and give them some size flags. Okay, the hbox container is quite small right now, let's see. Yeah, that's better. I guess this one doesn't really need the expand flags, but yeah, this should do. Keep it like that for now. As a placeholder, I'm just gonna drag in an image. I don't really have to worry about the sizes of the different images, because all of my images are 64 by 64 pixels. As long as I keep that consistent, I don't have to worry about this. if you're not gonna keep that consistent, you may wanna customize things a bit and make sure everything stays aligned properly. Now, I'm gonna give this hbox container some margins again, so the image isn't right in the corner. 10, 10, minus 10, minus 10. That seems fine. And this is where the text can go. I can just call this here text. I can just call this here image. And that should be fine. Now let's go in here and give this section another VBox container. Because inside of this VBox container, which again, full rectangles, and yeah, we don't need size flags. But we do want to add some margins, keeping it consistent. So what's gonna go in here is a variety of buttons that can be clicked. But since the number of buttons depends on exactly what we're doing with it, I'm not gonna be setting these right now. I'm still gonna apply my theme to this. On theme, put it in here. And that should be fine. That should apply to all the children. So, now we have this. We can put some placeholder text here. And everything is looking fine. Cool. So how are we going to fill this stuff? There's two things we want here. And since we're inside this big thing here, I'm just gonna add a button the same way we had in the preview scene earlier. Spawn dialog button. Something like that. Spawn dialog. I move this button over here. And this button is going to be what I am using to spawn this dialog in and make it visible and interactable and stuff. But in reality, you would probably instead spawn it in when you're talking to an NPC, interacting with an object, something like that. So I am giving this thing a script. And this button is actually what's going to decide exactly what dialog is going to be visible. So I don't want the dialog to be hard-coded into this box here. Instead, it's much simpler to once create this dialog pop-up. We can actually call it that. And we can actually save this as a separate scene. So if we say save branch as scene, put it back into the correct folder, then it's a bit simpler now. This is what we use, and it kind of becomes its own thing we can open there. So let's decide what to do with it. So this button needs to be able to spawn in a dialog scene, the dialog pop-up. So let's say var dialog scene equals preload. And now we need the location, so it's down here, so it's in res / dialog system / dialog popup.tscn. And that seems fine. I'm also gonna add a variable for the instance, which is now by default. Just so when we spawn one of these in, we can keep track and make sure we don't have several open at the same time, as that would get pretty confusing during gameplay. Now before we actually use these, let's decide on what our dialog is. So the way I'm gonna do this is our dialog is a dictionary, because this way we can have several options and, well, we can really go quite nested in this and just keep adding more information however we like. So what we can do is, for starters, say dialog option 0. This is a key we can use to access what our initial option is. And it has an image. So we can say image is, and what is it called? Necromancer.png, for example. And I'm making up these keys. You don't have to use the same keys I'm using here, but you have to keep whatever you call these things consistent. That way a script can later identify what you're trying to do. So we can put some text in here and say NPC text. And we can put some options in here. And these are going to be the selectable options the player can actually click on to decide what to do next. Now the options are a list, because as a list or an array, we can just iterate through them easily and pick one. But each option itself is again a dictionary. So we have text option 1, and I'm going to keep it like this for now. Text option 2. Text option 3. And in the case of option 3, we're just gonna exit, so I'll put that in here. And this is roughly what one of these dialog things might look like. But currently we only have number 0. We will also want to have number 1 and so on. You can call these whatever, but I'm just gonna number them, that way they're easy to tell apart. But now how are we going to specify which one to go to next? Leave a comma. So to specify where to go next, I'm just gonna say on each option here, we say next is 1. And that would mean that after we click this option, this dialog here is going to be left, and we instead go to this one. Then we can say 2. And in this case, because I want to exit, I'm going to keep one constant just to make sure we are able to exit things instantly. So on this one, I'm just going to say -1. This way we have an easy constant predefined, which allows us to exit. So whenever -1 is in here, we don't look for another option, we just exit. I'm gonna define that in code in a bit, but for now, we just decide what we want these things to work like, and then we implement it afterwards. So in case 1, let's just say we keep to the same layout, of course. Icon.png, we use the Godot icon here. Say text is reply 1. Say our options are actually, we only have one option here, we don't want to get too complicated. Text is exit, and next is -1. Okay, that one's fine. Go on to option 2, which still is referenced up here, and say image is, let's just use the necromancer again. Text is reply 2. Options is, and again just exit or whatever, or continue or whatever you want to write. I'll stick to exit. Next is -1, and so everything closes. What we can also do, instead of quitting here, we could just tell it that in case of number 1, we just go to number 2, or we could go back to number 0. So now if we click here, this button, it would take us to this dialog where it says reply 1. Then if we click this button, it would take us back to the beginning. And it would just keep letting us loop until eventually we click either the exit option or option 2. I'm not doing that right now, just some examples. The structure here can look a bit confusing when you're not used to the whole nested dictionary stuff yet, but I think it is pretty simple once you get down to it. You really just gotta decide on a few keywords you want to use and then put in the values each time. Essentially, you can just copy one of these over to create a new one. So now we have an option 3, which is currently not used anywhere, but here it is. It's always the same setup. So let's get rid of that again and decide how we are implementing these. Now we could say to always start at number 0, but since you might name these based on what they actually do and stuff instead of numbering them like I did, I'm instead going to say create a var start, and then we can put in whatever our start position is. Now we want this button to be able to actually spawn in a dialog pop-up, since we don't want this to always be visible. So I'm gonna delete this. We do have it as a separate scene. And let's hook up the button to itself. And now we can tell it if inst doesn't equal null, that is, if a dialog is already open for some reason, then we say queue free the old one. Get rid of the old dialog. We don't want two open at the same time. If we're trying to open a new one and there's already something open, get rid of the old one, then create the new one. So now we can say inst equals dialog scene dot instance as defined right up here. We can say, I'm just gonna say conversation data equals dialog, and I'm gonna say conversation start equals start. Yeah, I already recognized these things because I used them in the previous version of the script. That should be fine. Let's go in here. Now we have these two, conversation data and conversation start. these two variables don't exist right now. We're gonna have to create them. And of course, we're gonna have to say get parent.addChild inst. Otherwise, it's not gonna spawn. Now, if we try to run this, it's crashing because it says conversation data doesn't exist, and it would also crash on conversation start. So let's create these. We can go in here. We can create a script for this and give it these variables. I'm just gonna make some lines here. So var conversation data equals empty dictionary by default, and var conversation start equals 0 by default. It doesn't really matter, we're always gonna override these, but just so we can see what data type these should be. Now I'm gonna create a setup function. So this is not a pre-built function, this is one I'm gonna create myself. I'm just putting an underscore there because it's an internal function that shouldn't be used anywhere outside of the script. So here is where we actually start setting up our entire dialog view. Whatever should currently be displayed is going to be done in here. So let's just say var data equals conversation data, at a specific position. Now we can just say section in here, so we know what section to grab here. And this section here refers to what we did in this script. So this here is section 0, section 1, section 2. We're going to be using these here. And now to actually set this data, we are going to want to know where all of the changeable things are, like this image, this text, and so on. Let's just create some variables for these real quick. Onready var npc image equals vbox container slash npc section, and there's the image. Onready var npc text. Same thing, just with the text. There it is. And onready var player option box whatever vbox container. Okay, we want the vbox container in here. This thing. Okay, that should be fine, that should be usable. We can go in here and say npc text dot text equals data dot text. Now I'm using the dot operator here to access whatever is in here. So I'm saying this thing is what we currently have loaded, dot text. Alternatively, you could write data input string text. So you could use this. This is the same thing we're doing up here. The 0 is put in as section and opened here. That's fine. Either one works. I just use the slightly shorter version dot text, and the same for all of the other things here. A dictionary is quite similar to an object in our scene tree, so we can also treat it quite similarly by using the dot operator. npc image dot texture, and we can't really preload this because we don't know ahead of time which texture should be loaded here. If you want to have them preloaded, or if you feel like it's necessary, I guess we could have an auto-load or something and preload a whole bunch of images in there and then just use them here. Whatever you like. In my case, these are 64 by 64 sized images. They are really small. There's no need to preload this. I can load them at runtime and nobody's gonna notice. So these are at position dialog system slash images. They should all be in the same folder for me, so I can use it like that. And then just add the data.image name. Since, as we saw here, I only specified the name of the image, not the full path to it. No point doing that if they're all in the same folder. Just a bit easier to type everything out like this. Now we have this. Let us go. Yeah, let's test this actually. So to test this, we can just use the ready function and onReady call setup of conversation start. Let's give this a shot. There's our necromancer and NPC text. Just as we wrote in here, necromancer, NPC text. The options aren't visible yet. That's the next part we need to do. So let's get to it. Now, since I'm not just using the setup function once at the start, but also whenever we click a button, what we are going to want to do is make sure that any options that already existed in our list, like if we go in here, this VBox container could already have some children. We want to get rid of those first before we spawn in new ones. So let's do that. For child in player option box dot get children child dot queue free. Easy. And now that these are gone, we can create our new ones. So for option in data.options. Again, we named this options. This is not an inbuilt thing. This is this here, this string. Var button equals link button.new. I'm using link buttons here. You can use different type of buttons if you prefer the way they look. This is just a stylistic choice. Button.underline equals link button.underline mode on hover, because I prefer that. I don't want them to constantly be underlined, only when I hover them. This way there's an easy visual indicator that we are hovering a specific option. Button.text equals option.text, because that's what we specified. So now that we have this, we want to actually connect the button to something. We need a function to call when the button is pressed. So let's just create one. Func on player option button pressed next. And this next here is a variable that isn't technically part of a button. If I go in here and say add a button, then you can see here press doesn't specify any specific data. It's not going to pass us anything useful. But that's not a problem because we can add this manually. So for now, let's just say if next is equal to -1. That's our constant we specified earlier, in which case we just want to quit the current dialog. Then just say queue free and get rid of this entire dialog window. Otherwise, call setup again. This time using the next value to specify which section to get our data from. So originally it starts out with the conversation start, which is probably gonna be 0. Now whatever has been pressed, if it's not -1, this is where we go next. Now let's connect this button to that function. So button.connect pressed self, and the function is on player option button. A bit long, but that's fine. At least it's clear what it does. And now here is the thing. Normally this is all you're gonna use when connecting a signal, but it's a bit hard to read right now. But you can see here there's still a thing for binds. So there's an array where we can include additional information. So what we can do here is put that array. And we only need one value here. We only need options.next. So this option.next. So this value here, which is the .next value we need here, is now going to be stored inside of our connection between the button and this function. So whenever this button is clicked, we will also get this as an additional parameter in here. That's what tells us which of the buttons has been clicked, since we don't actually know how many there are, so we can't make a separate function for each one. So instead we just store which button is this and pass it as an argument here. Now we of course need to add the button to the box, so player option box.add child, otherwise it's not going to be visible even after we create it. Now let's take a look if this is working. We gotta run this. Okay, so it spawns this stuff up here fine still. We have 3 options. Option 3 should just close the window, and it does. Spawn it again. Option 1 should go to a different thing, and there we go, reply 1 with the Godot face. And option 2 goes to another necromancer thing with reply 2. So the rest is just customizing this text and doing whatever you want with it, really. So say I go in here and I just specify what I mentioned earlier. I go back to 0. Then I can say this stuff, option 1. This doesn't exit anymore, it just goes back now. I can press this as often as I like. It keeps going back until I press either exit or option 2 and then exit. the text doesn't really fit here anymore now that I changed it, so this should be like a restart conversation or something of the sort, so the player knows what's going on. So yeah, these are the basics of what you can do to start out designing a dialog pop-up. Of course, you can completely change this layout to whatever you like. You can make it a bar down here with separate flying buttons. I don't care. Make it look however you like. You can add more images to it. You can add all kinds of information to it. Currently, the way I did it, there's only a few options in here. But say you want a NPC name at the top, you can just go name, necromancer, and then add a field to the dialog pop-up where this can be displayed and stuff like that. So you can customize this however you like. These are just some examples. I would very much recommend you play around with that some more and see exactly how you can change it and to try and get a feel for this kind of structure. Even though in reality in large games you would normally save this kind of stuff into a separate file, oftentimes a JSON file, because it's very easy for people to edit even without much programming knowledge. But a JSON file has almost the same structure as what you see right here. So anything you can do in here, you can very easily transform into a JSON file, save it externally, and load it up on startup. Very easy to do. This also allows you to do stuff like localization. You can say, currently the text is just a string, but you can instead make the text another dictionary, put it like that, and say ENUS or something like that. I think that's how the format for these was, and ENUK other NPC text. You can have custom text for each language then inside of the structure and very easily let people edit it. So you can just prepare the structure, have this empty, or have some placeholder in it, and then tell somebody else to translate all of the things you want to have changed. So that's why you usually save this kind of stuff into a JSON file instead of putting it in your code. It's easier for other people to edit it who don't need to mess around inside of your code. But the structure is the same, so play around with this first and then get to the other stuff later, would be my suggestion if you're new to this kind of thing. Anyway, this will be all for today. Bye.